myself. There we go. So today we are talking about academic integration into integrating SEL into your academics. And we have two really exciting presentations for you today, mathematics and history social science coordinators from our county office. If you're just joining us, please make sure that you put your name, role, and location in the chat, and I'm putting the organizer there for you. As always, there are a ton of resources at the bottom of the organizer, including a lot of the resources shared today. So make sure that you get that, make a copy, and use that to take notes. So Luis, I'll go ahead and start by introducing myself if you haven't joined us before. My name is Melissa Spaden. I'm the Director of System of Supports on the Learning and Leadership Services side at SDCOE. I focus on implementation and improvement science, assessment, data, literacy, research to practice, policy, and obviously social emotional learning on the implementation and improvement side. Our presenter, Felicia Singleton, will be here closer to the end. She is helping lead the PBIS Coalition session right now, so she'll be joining us later, but she is also the Director of System of Supports on the Student Services and Programs side of the house. And then we have our other co-presenter here.
Hello, my name is Luis Lopez, and I'm Equity and Culture Teacher on Special Assignment for Curriculum and Instruction in the Sweetwater District.
And our co-presenters for our contents will introduce themselves to you when they get to their part, which will be very soon. So we're going to start out with a land acknowledgement. And this is something that Felicia usually does, so please give grace. We like to do this each time to acknowledge where we are and acknowledge those who were here before us. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. Today we gather on the ancestral lands that carry the footsteps of the Kumeyaay people. The Kumeyaay people have stewarded this land for centuries, and this land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. Today, the Kumeyaay people are present in 13 bands located on reservations throughout San Diego County. We pay respects to their elders past and present. We acknowledge this legacy. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. Our session outcomes for today. In this third session, we're bringing all of those pieces together that we've talked about the past couple weeks. And so we're going to talk about designing and coordinating a scaffolded professional learning plan and give you some examples of that. We're going to engage in learning around SEL and mathematics and history social science. And we'll identify some next steps and action planning goals. And as always, share many, many resources to help you do so. All right, Louis.
To start off our session, we're gonna think about what was our most interesting, useful, and overall impactful professional learning experience. So what is the commonalities that you had? We're gonna identify a spokesperson when we break out. And when we break out, we're just thinking about what is the best PD training that you ever had? What were the qualities about it? What made it great? What made it stick? What about it was the thing that made you bring something back and actually use it and implement it? So we're going to break out here in a second. And if you guys can choose a spokesperson inside that group, we'll come back and do a share out. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started.
You want us to go to the rooms or not?
If you would like to.
Okay. And then are you sharing a resource document or just the slides? Because I think what you put in the chat is the slides.
Oh, it is? Oops, I usually just share the resource document. Oh, fart. Okay, good point.
Okay, I'll join the room.
Okay.
Thanks.
Whoops. Okay, so if we're going to attempt a spokesperson share out waterfall chat. So fingers crossed it goes well. Basically, if you want to just put in any of those commonalities that you discussed, anything that popped up among the group in the chat, and what we're going to do, if you want to type those in, we'll all hit enter at the same time. That's how it's supposed to work. Again, I feel badly Felicia's not here yet because this is like our favorite thing in the world. Okay, so give another second to type things in, and when you are ready, go. Okay, so we have make and take activities and ideas that can be used in the classroom. Shared experiences includes interaction and relationship building, very important. Community of educators, human connection, experiencing new learning from the student perspective. I love that. We have personable, engaging, relevant. Katie Novak, UDL, shared analogies to make UDL more understandable, relatable, building connections. So we're seeing a lot of commonalities in the commonalities, that it needs to be applicable, relevant, it needs to be really attuned to what we're supposed to be doing right then with our specific students, and that there's sort of a community building experience within and a focus on relationships. Thank you, everyone. I hope this is a good warm welcome for you today.
Yeah, and reflecting on some of those, thinking about the way that we as educators really appreciate professional development, all the components that make a PD memorable. And just like all of the comments we made, the power of having a professional learning plan, anticipating what our teachers really need and what do they really want, right? I know that sometimes the frustrations I get are, okay, I get it, but how do I use it? Can you model it for me? I'm thinking about too, I always think about three things when we're doing PD: the professional development, the curriculum resources or the resources, and the coaching, which we'll also talk about today. If we're going to do the PD, is the resource available? And if the resource is available, is there a coach that's ready to help lead and guide people through those questions, right, as an effective implementation? So Melissa, I don't know if you wanted to add to this as well.
I think that's a huge part. I mean, a lot of it's been focused on, but I think the last part as well, that school and district leaders are expected to also be part of that, the professional learning that's occurring as well.
And I do understand that a lot of times maybe we might not have the coaches in place, but we can always put that as part of our multi-year professional learning plan, is integrating coaches into our professional development in the long term.
So as always, we try to give you some examples. This is pulled from a brief that Castle did that gave examples of specific places that have worked through implementation. And so this is in Illinois, in the Chicago-ish area. And what they did is this school district created sort of their ideals for what integration would look like. So they created these indicators that if they were doing walkthroughs, if they were walking around, things that they could see, things that they could hear, and practices that would be embedded if this was truly integrated within their academics and as part of their school, right? And so they have things like active participation, rigor. They talk about student talk, balancing or exceeding teacher talk. Students are doing the thinking first, and the opportunity for a lot of reflection. And so while they were creating these key indicators, they had to think about how this would occur. How do you make these indicators happen? So they created these 3 guiding questions. And I think we're all kind of suckers for alignment in this work, right? The 3 guiding questions, the 3 signature practices. And so what they did is they encouraged their educators to think about 3 guiding questions to focus their work across all content areas, right? So how do we get all learners to do the thinking and heavy lifting first before teachers weigh in with their thoughts? So a lot of that is that comfort with that wait time that we don't have, that extreme discomfort that exists, and letting the student do that heavy cognitive lifting. How do we get the voices of all learners to exceed teacher talk? And then how do we get learners to regularly reflect on SEL and academic skills? So really encouraging and creating that strong integration and calling out SEL language. And so what they did, and this is, what we're advising, is create this multi-year, really structured professional learning plan. This is just an example of their areas of focus for each year, but having that strong area of focus and realizing, we talk about this all the time with implementation of something new is like 3 to 5 years, right? It's not 1 year and done. And so it's an ongoing process that you're going to keep refining and improving. So that first year, they talked about, that basic level and figuring out what are some of the instructional practices that can occur across all content areas, just as a way of starting to ease people into that. Their second year, they really focus on adult SEL, which if you've joined us before for any of our sessions, adult SEL is the foundation to student SEL because adults need to experience it to truly understand it. Then that third year, they started really focusing on explicit instruction, the content integration, and all of that reflection and feedback. So this is where, like Luis mentioned, the coaching, this is where that observation of classrooms would occur. There would be some feedback. We would talk about what we saw and start gathering some data to reflect on that. And then that fourth year is when they actually focus on SEL assessment and reporting. And, this is not for accountability, but it's trying to understand how their system is doing, how their schools and students are feeling about the way this is rolling out. So a multi-year plan is really important to have, especially since you can't just throw everyone in right away, especially not right now. Luis?
Yeah, I was gonna say, now correct me if I'm wrong, and this really helped me ease my mind when I understood full implementation doesn't mean everybody, right? It's like about what, 50% of the staff is doing this, and we have full implementation.
So it's a little less scary when you think about it that way, right? And just piloting this work and easing folks into it. And so we wanted you to have this as we are now going into our first content area highlight, to think about how you can integrate SEL into the math classroom and it not be something completely terrifying. But I think Audrey will help ease your fears a little bit as well.
I hope so. Thanks for that. We don't want it to be terrifying. Math by itself is terrifying enough for so many people, which we're trying to fix as well. It's been traumatic and we're trying to undo that. So it's a perfect place for a playground of really intertwining and really embedding SEL and making sure that we're taking care of our students and each other. So I'm Audrey Mendeville. I work with the math team in the curriculum instructional department, also in learning and leadership services with Melissa. And to begin with, on the next slide, I wanted to just share that teaching mathematics is more than just the content area. Most people who are have been teaching mathematics for a while now know that when the Common Core state standards came out in California in 2010, we adopted 2 sets of standards for mathematics. Half of them are content standards, but the other half are these practice standards. And these practice standards, which I sometimes refer to as SMPs, I'm going to do my best to not use too many acronyms on you today, but these practice standards are how kids are engaged in the mathematics. And so I want you to just take a moment to just look at those 8 practices. They're K-12. So kindergartners are doing this, 12th graders are doing this. I resized them. I think these are pretty graphics, by the way. And when you're in the slides, I did put resources in the notes section. So if you like them, Ed Campos, who's a buddy of mine up in Northern California and a Q educator, made them and they're free. So you can download them, make them into stickers and plaster on your walls if you like them. But the idea here is that the reason that some of them are larger is that those are the ones you really want to be seeing kids do all the time. Like there should not be a day where kids are not making sense in math class. And there should not be a day where they're not attending to precision. And that's attending to precision with their language, not necessarily trying to get the right answer. And there's other ones that are valuable too, but they're embedded in specific cases. And what's crazy about this is teachers are like, yeah, I do this all the time. And we say, yeah, you do this, but now we need the students to do this. They're like, oh, right, okay, gotta teach kids how to do this. And when we started to investigate that, the Dana Center came out with a really interesting research study. And so on the next slide, we have just a quote for you here from the Dana Center. These new standards call for basic social and emotional skills necessary for students to successfully apply the mathematical practices. For example, let's read that. Oh, can you go back to the quote for just one more second? So the idea here is that you can't make sense of problems and persevere in solving them if you can't figure out how to apply self-management, self-awareness, and social awareness. Like, you have to do those things. So that's where the Dana Center, which is a kind of a research powerhouse out in Texas, came up with this idea. And I'm going to show you some more resources, which leads to the next slide now, Luis is an expert at, which is that social emotional learning gives students access to these mathematics practices, that without that learning, kids can't engage in these. And for each of these 8, they have a crosswalk diagram that shares what that looks like. So we're going to peek at it in the next slide just for that first one, but you'll notice in the links below, if you're in the slide deck, you can see all 8 of them. But here's an example. The language that's on the left-hand side, farthest left of the graph, is just the practice standard. Makes sense, it's off to the side there of problems and persevere in solving them. The text that's mostly in black but has a couple colored highlights is the language about what that means. And that comes out of our California standards, or the Common Core standards that we adopted as California. But then they highlighted it and they said, check this out. The language that's right here is social emotional learning competencies. It's exactly the same stuff. So for kids to be able to do this work in mathematics, they have to be building their social emotional learning competencies. And so we need to be giving kids opportunities to do that in mathematics. It becomes really critical to them being able to have those skills. So it's not like well, if we have time, we'll do some social emotional learning. It's like, we have to be doing this. It's the way we give our kids access to the kinds of mathematics experiences we want them to be having. So I wanted to share with you that, and I also wanted to share with you a quote on the next slide from an organization called Todos, which works about mathematics for all. I'll let you read this one. I truly believe that we can humanize this. I believe that we can think about centering our students. I believe that we can think of it not in spite of their humanity, but in light of. But that's where mathematics can really be beautiful and curious and wonderful, and not traumatic and scary and full of fear. And so that's the kind of math I'm hoping to share with you a little bit today. And we have resources for you in case that's not the math that you experienced, or that you have the resources to do as well. So on this next slide, we have a link for you to the lesson. If you'd like to go to the full lesson, you can. These come out of our distance learning resources. That bit.ly there will get you on the hot link to directly to this lesson, but this comes out of 7th grade. And the idea here was that we designed these for 7th graders who were going to be in some kind of distance learning platform. We didn't know what it was going to look like, but we wanted to share it with you. So just so you have context, I'm going to show you a very brief video. If you're familiar with 3-act tasks, it's one way that we can do mathematics. Luis is going to expertly show us the video, and then we're going to talk about how we can think about the social emotional learning embedded in this video. If you go back, it might be hidden on the notes. There we go. So that's what we'd start the lesson with. Now, I don't know about you, popping bubbles is one of my stress reliefs. I don't know if that helps any of you relieve stress. It helps my 2 children relieve stress often, although we usually take it and we're like crunching it like this. We're not doing it systematically like that. It's more of like a relieving the stress. But anyways, we have the context of that. And I misspoke. This is a 6th grade lesson. My apologies on that. So that's the context of this lesson. And we share the video and we start out by asking kids some questions. So on the next slide, one of the ways we might start asking some students some questions is we might say, at the very end of the video, there were 2 other pieces size bubble wrap. We might ask them, like, how long do you think it's going to take to pop those different size bubble wraps? And we ask them to make a guess, just right guess, a too high guess, a too low guess. Now, this is right there self-management, because we are slowing us down from jumping into doing all kinds of work and saying, hold on, don't just jump right in. Don't just go really fast forward, but slow yourself down and think about this for a little bit and make a guess. Start with a systematic process. So we're starting with self-management strategies. How can we do that? We can make a guess. We can guess a little too high to a little too low. We can be brave about that guess. It actually has that language in there about being brave. What does that mean? We can have a discussion about 0 is not very brave. You know, 1,000's not very brave, but what is brave? And what is brave for you might be different than what's brave for me, and that's okay too. On another slide, we have another excerpt from this lesson, which you might have scrolled down to, which asks a little bit later on, what information might be most useful to you? And again, this is about students being aware of their strengths and what they know and what they need to know. And this is, again, about self-awareness. This is about them building that knowledge about themselves and acknowledging that each one of us might have a different solution path. And that's great, actually, that there isn't one way to do mathematics. And actually, the more varied we have, the more likely it is we're going to come up with a creative solution, an idea for the world's problems, which might not be as easy as bubble wrap sometimes when you're dealing with things like pandemics and all kinds of situations that just arrive at our doorstep sometimes. So something to consider there. Another example from this lesson on the next slide is further on, they asked them to share with their classmates what they came up with. Look for ways your work is similar to each other and ways that your work is different. And this goes back to that social awareness. Can you take on someone else's perspective? Can you understand the approaches of others? And so again, the idea here in mathematics is it's not just about answer getting, it's about this understanding of themselves and of others that we're really trying to help students grow in. So I thought the example of this lesson might be easier for us to kind of think through the context of what it might mean for social emotional learning to be embedded inside of a lesson. I also wanted to acknowledge that on the next slide, that I know you all have thought about these 3 signature practices, about the welcoming or inclusive activity, that those engaging pedagogy and practices, and the optimistic closure. And so I just have I have those 3 pieces put together for this lesson as well, just for your consideration. So to open with, on the next slide, you might open this activity with, how do you take breaks or relieve stress throughout the work or school day, depending if this is for students or if this is for you all. Like, we could ask that question, because that is a great way for us to connect with both each other and with the content that we're about to talk about. It's a great way to also promote good strategies for how are we relieving stress, that we're not bottling it up on the inside, and we're finding good ways and productive ways to let off a little steam when we have it. So that's one way we could advocate for that there. On that second practice, we shared with you about the first SMP, the first mathematical practice, and below, I think it animates. We talked about both self-awareness, that students thinking metacognitively about identifying what information is helpful for them is super important for that. But we also have this responsible decision making, that students have to think through steps of a decision that they have to work through, and that's really important too. And we could do this for other SMPs. I wanted you to notice that we just did it for the first one in this example, but there were other SMPs also embedded there. For a closure, we might close by saying, how close were your estimates to figuring out that length of time? How does it compare? Does it make sense? And again, with that takeaway, with the knowledge you have now, how might you approach the problem differently next time? Or what are you taking with you to approach a new problem in the next time? And so we're embedding those practices back in to the same lesson and the same example. So I was only going to take a couple minutes because I know you have lots of other things to talk about with other friends, but I wanted you to just see this example of how we are working to embed social emotional learning with mathematics content. And I hope you can see that I hope it felt like it was woven really seamlessly together. Like you couldn't necessarily point out easily, ooh, that's social emotional learning, ooh, that's the math, but it felt like it was just one and the same. It was the learning that needed to happen for students. And that's what we really want to do. We want to thread them so well together that that's just the learning experience students happen, that it's that essential piece for them. My team has 3 wonderful people on the next slide that I'm just a member of. Mark Alcorn focuses on elementary mathematics, and you have his contact information there, while Mindy and I focus in on secondary mathematics, and you're welcome to contact us if you need further support in this area. But we're just thrilled that you gave us just a few minutes to share a little bit about our thinking around social emotional learning in mathematics today.
Thank you, Audrey. We'll just take a moment in case there's any questions or comments in the chat that people want to throw in. We're going to talk a little bit about planning, and then we'll go into history, social science. This planning part will be a lot more brief than developing a plan, but we want to make sure that you have plenty of content learning. And a great comment from Natalie. Thank you, Audrey. That was just what I needed to see how natural the SEL was integrated. So all of the resources as well, as usual, we'll share all the links and resources. But Audrey and I did a deep dive into some of those resources from the Dana Center, and they are great. They really clearly articulate that crosswalk between the, I forget what they're actually called. I call them the SMPs so much now from working with math, but the standards for mathematical practice and the SEL competencies. And so there's a really natural link between the two. Okay. So this is probably an overwhelming visual, but there have been questions about, all right, so how do we integrate all of these pieces? How do we create a plan? And I wanted to just give you a sample. This is from Castle's School Resource Center. I know a lot of the times we focus on the District Resource Center because we're taking that larger view, but it just gives an example of the first year of implementation of SEL, right? And how you would plan that out. What are the different strategies? What are some of the different actions that you would need to do? And if you live in LCAP land like I do, then that actions word is kind of triggering for you, thinking of all the things that would need to occur. And then what does 1 year look like? So, you're starting really at the beginning, gaining understanding, creating that team we've talked about before. Who's your initial pilot team for this work? Who are your initial pilot teachers who would feel comfortable doing something new and different in this realm? And who are those folks who would see that natural integration? Like Natalie pointed out, now I see it. Hey, who are those other folks like Natalie who would say, oh yeah, I see the connection, let's work on this together. And then thinking through all the way to the school year, how you would have to slowly implement, pilot these areas, setting goals for the work. It's important to set a goal for the year where you can get to by the end of the year. Don't forget the budget piece either. And then looking at the end at that implementation rubric that we've shared, the Castle rubrics can be intimidating. That's what our organizers are based off of. And the goal was that our organizer is a less intimidating version of the Castle rubric, but it's really giving you an idea of where you are now, so that your planning makes sense, that we use the language in LCAP, that it's ambitious yet achievable, and that you have that, basically your whole stakeholder group there has that understanding of where you are as a team, so you can guide that work going forward. So this is linked as well, and you have this resource. There are a ton of these sample plans for you, but Luis is going to now talk through basically what this looks like in his world.
Thank you so much. And I just want to tie it all together. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very brief, and sorry for throwing so much at you at one time, but really want to have you process time. So this is part of our resources. I just wanted to show you what this looks like in practice, at least in Sweetwater. So I've been working with our ELD, TOSA, Dolly, Charles Dickey, to understand how do we integrate ELD and SEL, right? Because there's the affective and the cognitive. And the best practices for ELD is, well, to build community and connection, to get them to speak, read, write, and listen, right? So what I'm going to share with you is a template. We want to really promote adult SEL. So we always start with ourselves, right? And as Audrey modeled for us as well, is our self check-in, like how are we doing before the lesson? right? How is our classroom community? How do they feel safe? Do any community building activities need to occur first? And are the norms in place? Is there a norm I want to focus on for this lesson before we actually get into the lesson? Which SEL competency are we going to look at? This is an example of SEL integrated in health, right? Looking at our student learner outcomes and integrating the language targets. But the innovation is more on the essential questions being SEL essential questions, right? Being, well, self-awareness. This lesson's about understanding anxiety. So what is something that I am anxious or worried about? Self-management, how can I manage my own anxiety and worry? And social awareness, how can I help others when they're experiencing anxiety and worry? So in Sweetwater, we're used to using understanding by design. So, let's start with our assets. We're already strong here. So let's do a welcome inclusion activity within each content area lesson. Let's incorporate the engaging strategies into the lesson. And let's end with an optimistic closure so we have a systemic approach, right? And just what's included in your packet is this blank template that you can modify for any content area, right? And as wonderful Audrey just explained to us about how SEL is already in mathematics, right? So what I did is I took the template and used the standards for mathematical practice, right? And included those self-checks, those classroom management, and the essential questions, right? And we can do that with any content area. Here's another example of how we're doing that in science at the moment. This is a lesson about recycling in science, right? Self-check for ourselves, the norms. And again, the innovation is, since it's a lesson about recycling, let's integrate SEL by asking SEL questions, right? What do I think about when I see the word recycling? Self-management, how often do I put items in the recycling bin, right? And how can I recycle to be more connected to my community? And again, within the content area, welcome practices, the inclusion activity. And this also then starts to be a coaching tool for myself, right? When we go in and integrate SEL into the different content areas, I can use this as my observation tool as well. Now, before I move on, I want to acknowledge that Alyssa Graham is here. She's a former Sweetwater Union High School District Teacher of the Year, and I've seen her integrate SEL in a very masterful way. So it's definitely possible. And once you start unpacking it for your content areas, you can see that SEL is already in everything because language is in everything. So I want to go ahead and pass it over to wonderful Matt Hayes, and he's going to walk us through how it is in history and social science classroom.
All right, thank you, Luis. I appreciate that. I must admit, I got a little bit nervous when I saw Luis was here because I know Luis he knows the content that I'm going to be talking about really well too. So he'll check me and make sure that everything is on the up and up. But it's good to see you, Luis. It's been, as I said earlier, it's been a while. It's been a weird year. So my name is Matt Hayes, and I am the History Social Science Coordinator at the San Diego County Office of Education. And it's my pleasure to spend a few minutes with you all to share some of my thoughts and ideas and some resources around integrating SEL into the History Social Science classroom. So before we do that, I just want to check to see where you are at this point in the afternoon or evening, depending on how you look at the day. Luis, would you go to the next slide? If you could just type in the chat the number of GIF that relates to how you feel at this moment right now. So take a look at these history GIFs and see which one relates to you. I see a lot of twos, which it's not surprising for this time in the day. Yeah, looks like lots of twos. And a 4. Am I the only one that's a 3? Oh, did I put mine in there? Perfect. All right, good. Well, it looks like we have a variety of states in which we're at right now. And I aim to get you all to number 3 by the time I'm done here in the next few minutes. All right, Luis, do you want to go ahead and click this slide? All right, so I wanted to start off with this picture, and I'm going to start off with the content, which I think is often a little bit different when we are at a PD that's kind of focusing on strategies and implementation. But I share this photograph here. It's has to do with the Bracero program, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Bracero program, but it's in American history. There have been a number of times when the United States has launched kind of guest worker programs, and our history social science framework under legislation has lifted the significance of the I shouldn't say significance, but the prominence of the Bracero program within the curriculum. And that's as the result of legislation. But it's important too for a lot of other reasons. And I wanted to share just a little story. A few years ago, the state had funded some workshops to help teachers integrate the stories of the Bracero into their classrooms. And so we hosted one of the workshops here. And it was interesting because the person they brought in was from Virginia, which I thought was interesting because I'm sure we can find a lot of California connections as well. But at the end of the workshop, what happened was a number of people raised their hands and they said, hey, you know, my grandparents came as part of the Bracero program. My parents came, my family came as part of the Bracero program. And the facilitator said, this is a response that I get every single time I host this workshop and I talk about the Bracero program. He said, I've done a lot of other workshops and I don't get the same response. And it just served as a reminder to me of the personal connection that we have as adults and our students have to the content that we're teaching. And so, and it can often be a very uplifting experience. Like this was an experience, it was, it kind of, these things, you know, the hairs on the back of my neck raise up when I hear these, and it gets emotional because, you know, you see these people talking with pride about their family's history. And as I said, so that can be a very uplifting experience. But as many of you know, in the world of history, social science, a lot of the topics we talk about can be extremely emotional, and there are very emotional sides to the story of the Bracero as well, and that impacts our students. And so as I was listening to Audrey speak earlier, I was thinking about that because it's, you know, it's as she was talking about the human side of mathematics. I think it's important to think about the human side of history and social science, which I know many of you do. But a lot of times our textbooks, I as a teacher often presented in sort of an academic way, has sort of detached. But it's important to remember that, you know, these are the stories of our students. And also it's an opportunity for us to build from their experiences and their families' experiences. And so I'll kind of talk about that a little bit in just a moment. All right, Luis, there we go. I wanted to talk a little bit about the 2016 History Social Science Framework. I'm not sure how many of you read it on a nightly basis before you go to bed like I do and have it memorized and have read all 1,000 and whatever page. I'm just kidding. I haven't read the whole thing myself. But in 2016, the state of California adopted a new framework. And it's significant because whereas in other disciplines, we've seen new standards, we're still operating off of I almost said 20-something, 1998 history social science standards. And we know that instruction, the teaching and learning has changed quite a bit since those days. And so the framework really tries to address that. And it does that by focusing on not only content, and I'm spending a lot of time talking about content because of the connections between SEL and the things that we talk about. It focuses on content, literacy, inquiry, and civic learning. There we go, another acronym for you to memorize, CLICK. It's inquiry-based. So it's really asking us to work with our students on asking and answering significant questions about the content. It's organized around themes, which again, I'll show you in just a moment, and cascading questions, that's sort of larger essentialist-like questions to very specific questions focused on the content. And importantly, it aims to be more reflective of the diverse student population in California. Again, when you think back to 1998, our curriculum, particularly in history, social science, really was not reflective of the students. And so when the new framework was published in 2016, the writers really took it upon themselves to try and include as many voices and stories as they could, knowing that they couldn't include everything, but they really worked to try and give students an opportunity to see themselves in the curriculum. All right, so these things, and here again, it's another quote from the framework. I tried to find, Audrey was able to find some stuff directly referencing SEL. And unfortunately, when I searched through our framework, I couldn't see it. But from this quote, I was able to see this connection between what we're trying to do, the larger goals, and really the need to support the human side of working with students here. So I wanted to give you just a moment to read this quote and to write in the chat any connections you see to these goals that are outlined here and what you've been thinking about with work around social emotional learning. So I see learning their place in the world and social and self-awareness. They're popping in faster than I can read. Make reasoned decisions, responsible decision-making, prepare students for college, right? Affirm identity, which is huge. And again, something that we'll see an example of in a moment. So we're seeing these connections between the goals of what our framework says the goals are of the discipline, what we hope to see kind of big picture our students take away from their studies K-12 in history, social science, right? And some of the things that we've been talking about here in SEL. And so it becomes that natural fit, right? It embeds diversity training, participating in the democratic system. All of these aspects really, again, speak to that humanist nature of the discipline and the work that we want to do with our students. All right, thank you. Okay, Luis. All right, so in the spirit of the framework, I kind of was thinking about this question. How can educators make those natural connections between content and SEL? All right, Luis. So as Audrey did, I wanted to share one of the lessons that we have from some of the work we did to support teachers this year in developing units that are online. And I put a link to the entire unit there. I just wanted to kind of make a quick note about this particular unit. It's different. This one is an 11th grade unit. It's a little bit different from some of the other units that we developed in that it is designed to go at the beginning of the year and preview a lot of content. And it really does focus on one of the bigger questions or themes that the framework talks about, which is what does it mean to be an American in modern times? So again, it's really picking up on that idea of identity. So the students, please go ahead and next slide. The students develop that sense of self-awareness. Okay, Luis. And it starts off with an activity to get the students thinking about their own ideas around what it means to be an American in modern times. And so they start off by looking at some interviews that were taken by someone who had kind of traveled up and down the United States, and asking the interviewer asked the interviewees to respond to the question, so the students can see some ideas there. We asked them to interview a family member or a friend or a classmate to see what their perspective is. And then the students themselves take time to reflect on that as well, thinking about, okay, so what does it mean to be an American? And so they start to develop their own thoughts and record their thinking there. All right, Luis, thank you. And then we kind of move into that social awareness piece, which we sort of touch on in the first part of the unit. But in the next part of the unit, the students really begin to spend time thinking about and analyzing and looking at the perspectives and points of view of others. Okay, Luis. So here, we're going to have students take a look at this idea of the kind of this American identity and look at different ways people expressed it through art across time and across space in kind of the modern American history chunk of time. And so this unit has a number of links to resources, if you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, aligned to the themes of work and labor movement, wartime, environment, movements for equality, immigration. So we give them links to all sorts of works of art. And the students spend some time analyzing those and thinking about, at the time that those pieces were made, what was it that the creator of that piece of art was thinking about what it means to be an American, and how does that person portray that message? And we ask them to look at it in a couple of different areas so that they have a bit of a breadth of experience in looking at other people's ideas. And then at the end of this particular piece, we have them engage in some reflective thinking. And first of all, thinking about what art in general can tell us about the American identity, and how the pieces that they looked at helped them come to those conclusions. And then to go back to their original thinking that they started with at the beginning to see, okay, so how does what I have seen inform my own thinking? Does it change the way I think? Does it reinforce it? Is it adding something new? Is it contradicting? Am I rethinking of this? But really kind of getting into the metacognitive space of moving their learning along throughout the lesson. And so the rest of the unit kind of goes along the same way. And in the end, the students are asked to develop, they're asked to develop a museum show around the idea of the American identity and select pieces of art that would portray their particular perspective there again. So I'm showing these couple pieces here, as I said, to relate to that idea of social awareness and also their own personal identity. But it's really, these lessons are built around the content. So they're engaging in this particular unit, engaging in some work around historical thinking as well. So the connection, again, tries to be seamless between that social emotional piece and the content. All right, Luis? I did want to share a couple of other resources. And I noticed there were a lot of elementary teachers in here, so I'll drop a couple of other resources in the chat. These ones tend to be more secondary. I know Facing History in Ourselves is starting to develop more elementary resources. But the one thing that I would highlight for everybody here today is on the left, there is a link to a lot of different teaching strategies. And they have a great library. And all of these strategies, Facing History does a nice job of aligning kind of identity work, a lot of the work we're seeing around ethnic studies now, but also they're very aware of and thoughtful in incorporating some of the strategies that support the SEL work. And then on the right, there are some really well built out resources there. I am going to shamelessly plug an event that we're doing with Facing History next week on choices in Little Rock, and it's on the integration of Little Rock High School. And it's free, and you get a free hard copy of their case study around Little Rock if anybody's interested. One of the other pieces that really stood out to me when I was looking at some of the work that Melissa had been doing around SEL, and Luis and all of you, was around ethical decision making. And for older kids, there's this really great resource. I normally don't plug things that there's a cost for, but Choices does have some free lessons online, but they have some really powerful units that are built around some pretty significant issues and how students think through and make choices, ethical choices around some, as I said, some pretty serious topics there. All right, Luis. All right, so as I close out my piece, I wanted to give you one more moment to share some of your ideas in the chat. What is one thing that you found useful from what I've said, or something that you would like to explore more as you continue to reflect on history, social science, and its connections to SEL? And in a moment, I'll drop those other resources in the chat. Actually, I'll wait till I'm done. I can't talk and copy and paste at the same time.
Perfectly okay. And Matt is going to include them in the slides as will be sent out.
Yeah.
As well. We post everything on the site. I'm going to just go ahead and put the site link in there because we'll be sharing that shortly, or posting everything shortly
Right.
as this recording does the conversion piece.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much, Matt.
All right, thank you. And the last slide just has my contact information. So, all right. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. So as we get ready to close the session and this series on academic SEL, we want you to think about your next steps. As our optimistic close, just pick something that now that spring breaks, I think, are mostly over. Maybe a 1 week goal, if you'd like to set a 1 week goal for yourself, and just take a moment and throw that in the chat whenever you're ready. What is one goal that you can set for yourself to accomplish maybe in the next week or the next month? How about those two? And Luis, if you don't mind just putting that last slide up as we go, since it is right on the hour and we like to be timely. Thank you for the reflections in the chat as well. We see the clarity of how SEL is interwoven into our history curriculum. For Matt's optimistic closure, it's important to connect history to students' experiences. And we see goals coming in now. Work with my teammates to develop a plan to integrate SEL. Meeting with my SEL partner tomorrow to begin developing our strategic plan. That's beautiful. And as you keep entering, I just want to review what we went over today. So we talked a little bit about how to design a coordinated and scaffolded professional learning plan, and you have plenty of resources in the note-taking document for that. Engaged in some learning around SEL in mathematics and history, social science, and then did some work to identify some next steps and action planning goals. As always, we have a number of resources for you. Everything that's in the slides is available on the website as well, and that should be up by tomorrow, as long as it takes my computer to convert and stop arguing with me. And please join us for our last series, which will be starting next Tuesday because we are crazy. And it will be SEL's school-wide SEL. So we'll be focusing on implementing at the school level. So if you're a charter, this will work well for you. If you are trying to pilot this work with one specific school site or think about what that would look like, we'll be starting that next week. So thank you. Here's our contact information. And thank you for joining us today. hear my son meowing.